So this is normally where I introduce the speaker, so the speaker's me. So in case you don't know that, my name's Dennis Hanisak, and usually I talk about how I came here and did research. And this whole talk really, as I mentioned last week, is really to talk about some other things that I do. And this path is much more involved in education. So, you know, when I was thinking about what am I going to tell people, you know, it's like I thought I would just share with you how I got into education here. So Harbor Branch, when we were founded, was always exclusively research. It was closed to the outside. We did not do any education at all for a long time to speak of, except the postdoc program. And around 1989, some of us began being interested in adding an education component. And for university courses, for example, we actually partnered with FIT, Florida Institute of Technology in Melbourne, and a lot of us had appointments that allowed us to teach here at Harbor Branch courses to FIT students. This building that you're in now was actually built as a result of that in 1990, so we could actually have a teaching lab, because before we were just nestled in an old lab that hardly had any space. And actually the layout of this auditorium that you see, behind the scenes and everything, was all designed in response to participating in Bob Ballard's, and a lot of you know that name, Jason project, which focused on telepresence. Telepresence, as you can see, real time what's going on a cruise somewhere out in the world. Back in 1990, that was revolutionary, and we actually had equipment up front, and people here could like steer an ROV, you know, someplace far away in the ocean. So in 1991, we started that program, and we were very ambitious, and we had like 5 times during the day for 2 weeks, 5 times a day for 2 weeks, where people could come just like yourself and come in and watch it. And we had a lot of school groups coming in. And so I said, well, okay, that's great. Who's going to be in the room from Harbor Branch? Oh, why do we need anybody from Harbor Branch? The whole thing's done remotely. I'm there, you got to have somebody in the room. And they said, well, maybe a scientist. And I said, okay. So that's actually how I got into education, because there wasn't anybody else. So I decided to do it. Now, sidebar, footnote, my older daughter, Kim, who applied totally independently from Harbor Branch through Vero Beach High School, was actually on the expedition as a high school student for part of that. So for at least part of it there, I got an occasional glimpse of her. So, you know, it was a little bonus for me. And then in year 2000, when I was still director of the Marine Science Division, which I was for a long time, I was actually asked to merge, as in eliminate, the Education Division into the Marine Science Division. And so that's what I was tasked with, so, you know, I thought about it. After a couple months, I turned that management decision around by making the case to actually expand, not contract, what Harbor Branch did in education. So, for example, the first thing that we did was in 2001, with the help of 4 other research scientists here, we started Semester by the Sea. And sometimes on Wednesdays, you see students scurrying around over there in the lab, because they have lab all day on Wednesdays in fieldwork. And now it's in its 19th year, and that's a very special immersion semester of marine science for undergraduates. So, the only other thing I would say about my education interest is, again, not being interested initially at all. Now I realize that the research and education needs to come together very strongly. So any course or program that I personally teach in has a strong focus on taking students in the field. I don't teach just in lectures, and get out there and observe, experience, and sample nature. And that's what I do, and that's what we do in marine science education here at Harbor Branch. So that's kind of a long preamble, but you see it's partly part of my talk without the slides. So now if we can have the slides, Jill. So that's kind of this long background. So today I'm going to talk about a very special program that's now in our 6th year, the Junior Scientist Program. And I'm going to give you a quick outline. I think most of you know about the lagoon, but I think it's important that we set the stage with talking about the lagoon. Then I'm going to talk about this very special partnership with between Harbor Branch and the Indian River Land Trust, and we have 2 of the folks here. I'm not sure I saw them walk in, but there they are. So and I'll mention Ken a couple of times probably in the talk. And we're going to talk about a very special piece of land that we work with them. It's their land. We just kind of help out and get into the program. And I'm actually going to tell most of the story by showing you posters of what the students did over 6 years. Don't think that I want you to read all the stuff that's on the poster. I'm just using that as a backdrop to kind of tell my story, okay? And I'll point out a few things here and there. But I really want to give you the sense that this program took a while to really develop. I mean, it gets better every year is our goal, and it has. And then I'm going to try to wrap it up, at the end. By then it should be like 6:30, 7 o'clock probably. But the traffic will be better. Y'all know where the lagoon is. We all live on the lagoon. We work along the lagoon. We play along the lagoon. And it's a very special place. When I first came here, the person I came here to work showed me it for just a minute or two, and he said, it's an amazing place, but we don't know very much about it. So that always echoed in my brain. What do we know? Some simple statistics. It's very long and skinny, and it's about 40% of the east coast of Florida. It's one of the largest barrier island tidal inlet systems in the whole continental United States. It's very special, very diverse, and it is recognized as national significance, and I'll talk about that again. Why should we even care about estuaries? Why are they important in general? And they provide food, living space, and protection for a wide range of organisms. We think mostly about the fish, both commercial and recreational fish, but also they're very environmentally important. It has much lower energy than coastal oceans, so if you go to the beach now, most days it's pretty rough, right? Well, the lagoon is very calm most days, and so it's kind of a much more quiescent kind of place. There's a very high amount of productivity in terms of biomass production, and that's used locally by different animals and sometimes can be exported elsewhere. And many species spend part of their lives in an estuary. It's kind of a safe place. It's kind of like a nursery ground. And then, then they might migrate offshore. They may go a considerable distance away from the estuary from which they started their lives at. We talk about high diversity, and it is sometimes said to be the most. We don't go with that. I say that it's highly diverse. It's probably among the most biologically diverse estuaries in North America. And one of the reasons for that is it straddles, and I'll try to use the arrow every now and then, the pointer here. You can see we're right here, and we have things that come in from the colder water to the north and the warmer water to the south. And these inlets that we have are very important for that conductivity to the north and the south. And this is really one of the driving factors for biodiversity. But it's not the only thing. It's fostered by all these different types of habitats that we have. So salt marshes, mangroves, seagrasses, they're all plant-based communities, and that's what I study in my research life. And they're foremost among the habitats to make a healthy and diverse lagoon. And so, you've heard me in the past, most of you talk about seagrass decline and why that's bad. That's because it's just such an important part of the habitat in the lagoon. If you look at the whole watershed, by the way, a lot of times this is quoted as there's 2,100 plant species in the lagoon. That's false. It's actually in the watershed, so you have to read it very carefully, but most people don't say it that way. That's how many is in the watershed. So when we look at the estuary, we also look more broadly into the watershed. And we have more than 2,200 animal species, including 700 fish species. Grant Gilmore, who worked at Harbor Branch here for 28 years, was one of the first employees. He's the one who really put IRL on the map for biodiversity because of what he saw in the fishes. We have over 300 species of birds. I'm sure a lot of you enjoy birding. Either you take it seriously, or sometimes you just look around and you say, "Oh, that's an Ellie bird. Ellie's here. She knows what I'm talking about." She did her master's degree on one of those birds up there. The IRL is also home to at least 1,000 invertebrate species. I say that is because we really haven't inventoried the lagoon very well for invertebrates. We used to do a lot of work on that here and at the Smithsonian, but there's a lot less work being done now than, say, 2 or 3 decades ago. So we're losing a lot of information. We have a lot of endangered species. Many more than really anywhere else in the country are found in our area. And these include 12 endangered plants and 36 animals, again, in that watershed. Marine mammals, some of you are very interested in manatees. We have about a third of the country's population right here in the IRL. We have about 1,000 bottlenose dolphins that reside in the IRL. And they really don't go very far away, if at all. Sometimes maybe they go out the inlets. But they're very much residents year-round here. Maybe you say, okay, so show me the green, show me the money. An economic driver. A couple years ago, the latest estimate is it's about $8 billion a year. That's about 1/7 of the entire economy of our region. So this is derived from things like recreational uses, fishing, property values, all those kinds of things. You can't fully put a value on aesthetics and some of the uses that we have. We know that a lot of us live here. We know that the place has changed quite a lot, and that we have this real high developments. A lot of us like to live right near the lagoon, and we do. And a lot of people like to get away, jump in a boat, and escape the what goes on land, and get in water, and right away it's kind of a different kind of feel, even though you maybe you've only gone 2 miles from your house. So I said it's an estuary of national significance. In particularly, it's only one that have that designation of 28 in the United States. And basically, the goal of an estuarine program is to protect the ecologically significant estuary that's threatened by degradation, primarily because of things that we do. And they're really a coordination group. They don't have any enforcement power. They get people together in a room, all the different agencies and the scientists, and they try to come up with solutions to problems. And the IRL has been designated a lot of other things, like an outstanding Florida waterway. We have an aquatic preserve, several of them actually, in the lagoon, that are often, sometimes, a little bit more protection for some of the organisms that live there. So let's talk a little bit about Harbor Branch. Here we are. We're right here in the Ed Center, right here. I can't find the mouse. There it is. We're right here in the Ed Center, but you can see what a spectacular place to work every day, and just be right there on the lagoon. So not a surprise, a lot of our research and a lot of our education really does focus on the IRL. I wanted to mention, before I talked about this specific program today, that we actually have a very strong track record in high school education. A lot of people don't know about this. We don't make a big deal about it. It's just kind of something that we've been doing. It's all based right here in this building, and we have some great educators, and I see one, maybe two in the audience right now. And our first program that's still ongoing was with Lincoln Park Academy. We call it LPA Harborside. It was launched before the turn of the century, I like to say. And what this was working with a couple of the high school classes and the teachers. And the students come here basically about 3 times a month, 2-3 times a month. And they only come for like 1 class period. So it's not a lot, but it was a really significant step. And that actually led about 10 years later, right before we became part of FAU. We launched with Westwood High School, another high school in Fort Pierce, MOA, the Marine and Oceanographic Academy. And sometimes you'll see high school students coming here from MOA with some of their teachers to catch a lecture. And we really upped the ante here. We basically teach 15% on average of all the science classes. Everybody there, the emphasis is taking marine science and environmental science as their science courses for their 4 years. And we have our educators and our scientists and engineers actively get involved in teaching. And this is, and then what happened is it started in this little annex next door to us with 100 students, and it led to across the street, Old Dixie Highway. If you come in there, you always wonder, what's that little school thing doing there? That is MOA. It's on a long-term lease between FAU Harbor Branch and the school district. And so there's a long-term commitment been made by the school district. And we can handle 400 students. The junior scientist program, we started after that in 2013, which I'll say more about. We, since 2014, have been doing a summer program with Pine Jog. Pine Jog is an educational part of FAU down further south near Boca. And it's called H2O to Go. And the whole idea there is to teach students a little bit more about what goes on in Florida in terms of water and humans and how we all interact. You'll see that's a common theme throughout everything we do. And then just recently, some of you may notice at the 4 o'clock lecture, we have a group coming here every week over here to my right, your left, from the upward bound St. Lucie County. This is something we basically, I think we had a meeting the last work day before Christmas, and I said, yeah, we can make it happen. And then I called somebody who worked for me, and as a researcher who wanted to maybe become an educator, and I say, I have a deal for you. And she's doing a really good job, and you can talk to any of these students, and you'll hear, I hope, more about Upward Bound St. Lucie County at Harbor Branch in the future. And that is administered through Indian River State College. Next up, I need to talk about the Indian River Land Trust. So basically their mission, and some of you may know about it, but we have two people who can answer everything you want to know about the land trust sitting right here, is basically to promote the preservation, conservation, improvement of natural resources, the land, the special places that are in Indian River County, and for the benefit of the future, the current and future generations. And they started out actually, some of you know McKee, the botanical garden. Well, it wasn't always a botanical garden. When I first came here, it was an abandoned, basically, I guess what you call it, amusement park, an attraction, a tourist attraction, that once the interstate got built, people didn't want to drive off the interstate all the way to Route 1, and it had fallen on hard times. It started to be developed, and then a number of citizens came together in the early 1990s, and they decided to save that area because it had some great natural resources on it, and they did save it, and that spun off from the land trust. And then about 10 years ago, when we all remember the stock market crashed and the employment rate skyrocketed and a lot of people were in trouble financially, that was a great buying opportunity for lands up and down the lagoon. And that's what the land trust has done. And they have bought 1,000 acres, which is incredible, of environmentally sensitive lands up and down the lagoon. And you can see the map. And there's some of them you can go to, and if you want to know more about them, you can ask any of us. But if you live in Indian River County in particular, you might want to talk to the people at the land trust and see how you might get involved. This is an aerial photo of the county, of Indian River County. And you can see, most of us live right along the lagoon. But you can also see that there's this greenway that now will be here for a very, very long time, thanks to people like the land trust. It's mostly the land trust. There's some others involved. So this is a great opportunity for us living here now and into the future. And particularly near the southern end of the county, just 5 minutes from here, is the Coastal Oaks Preserve. So what happened was that in 2012, Ken Grudens, who's sitting right there, who's the director then and still the director of the land trust, and 3 of his colleagues from the land trust came to Harbor Branch to meet Margaret Linen, who was our director at the time, and myself. And they were basically saying, is there any way we could kind of work together, kind of collaborate? And we talked about possibilities, and I told them some things that we'd done in the past, and then everybody kind of looked at me, and they said, you'll come up with something. And I worked very strongly with Ken, and we did come up with something. What we decided to do is to build on our strength of high school work. And all that had been in St. Lucie County, which is fine, because after all, this is St. Lucie County. I live in Indian River County. Ken lives in Indian River County. I mean, the idea that I could actually do something in my own county was really cool. But which high school? Well, there's 3 public high schools, so we decided, let's work with all 3 of the public high schools. And let's see if we can develop a unique after-school opportunity for these students. To do what? A couple things. To learn about the value of the lagoon, of the lands that surround it, the need to protect them long-term, the need to manage them long-term, and to have them actively engaged in research with the idea that that would be an incredibly good experience for them, that they could benefit now and hopefully in the future in more ways than one. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So initially, the property was designated as it was up there with the boundaries marked here. It was 191 acres. They bought it in 2011. Our conversation was shortly thereafter in 2012. It has a lot of cool things like maritime hammocks. I'll show you some pictures. It has marine and freshwater wetlands. It has a seagrass bed offshore that we didn't know anything about, but you'll see we learned a lot about it. And then they bought an additional 29 acres here called the Martin property 5 years after that. So it would have been, I think, over 400 and some houses were to have been built there. And you can see that there's development, north to the south. So, I mean, years from now, people would never have known the difference. They never would have known that was even there. So, again, this is just one of many properties that they have bought with the land trust. So I said, let's come together. And, it's a great idea, but, how are we going to execute it? So how we executed it was the first couple of years, Ken and I would actually go around to the 3 high schools, try to get as many science teachers in the room as possible, and we would kind of pitch the program and say, well, here's what we want to do. And after a couple of years, we found that in each school there was a teacher who usually had a key position. Maybe she was a department chair. Or maybe he was a new guy who'd come in from California to do a biotech program at one of the high schools. And he had some students that might be interested. And we kind of just made it up from there. And the very first year was really challenging because myself and my staff, first of all, what do we really know about lands? We work in the water. And also, we had never been on the property until, we said, let's do this. So we had to learn a lot about the property ourselves before we could kind of engage the students. And again, the Land Trust was a great partner, and their staff, always facilitated our access and so on. So basically, we call this a research program by the next generation to preserve our natural resources for all generations. Sounds kind of ambitious. I'll let you decide how it's going at the end. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we think it's a great opportunity. And as I hinted in my introduction, the students get in the water, they get dirty on land, they do a lot of work. It's 3 hours every Monday from mid-September until about early February, and then we go, and I'll explain that February thing in a minute, and then we go to about twice a month until April. And then usually that last month the students are taking tests or going on trips and things like that. So this has really worked out for us. And again, we tweak it every single year. We make it a little bit different, hopefully a little bit better. I could give you all kinds of other reasons, like why we need to get more young people involved in STEM. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So if you haven't heard that expression before, sometimes it's called STEAM. You throw art in there as well. STEAM is kind of a newer take on STEM. But basically, it's just trying to foster. If you want one statistic that says, why should you do this, it's the one down in the corner. That in this century, about 60% of the jobs that are needed, only about 20% of our workforce has. And a lot of those jobs, especially the new jobs, they're going to require a STEM background. So STEM should be in all schools, and it should be fortified in all schools as much as possible. So this is just our little way of doing that. I could also tell you that these kinds of programs are really important for critical thinking. So aside from the fact that I think it's important to get people out into nature because they don't get out there enough, I think especially for the younger folks, we want them to learn some things kind of the scientific way so that they will just think better, so that they'll know the difference between real news and news that may not be so real. So that they can, I always say that if a person is going to grow up in Florida, they really need to understand what goes on with water and land and people and saltwater and freshwater. And that's what we try to do. So you can read all that stuff, but basically the bottom line is it's good to let people think, especially when they're young and trying to figure out what they want to do moving forward. So I'm going to take you through the program year by year because I want you to see that how it started and how it continued to build, and then where we are today. And you can go out and see exactly where we are by looking at some of the things we have out in the gallery. So the group shot is our first group. And, you always go back to the first group because if it didn't work well the first time, you weren't going to have a second year maybe. So we did well. And like I told you, we really didn't know very much about the environment there. We didn't know, what kinds of projects we could really do. We had written some proposals. I should have explained that earlier, that one of the outcomes of that meeting with Ken Grudens and Margaret Leinen is that we wrote a proposal to Impact 100. A lot of you know that's a bunch of committed women who donate $1,000 each. And that money adds up to a lot of money. And they give out grants that are $100,000 for a year, which is not bad. And we did not get it, but we got runner-up for $7,000. So $7,000 is what we started with. And then both Harbor Branch and the Land Trust, Ken and Margaret, committed both of our institutions to continue to make the program happen. So the following year, I wrote another grant to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that got funded for a couple of years, and that was really good. And ever since then, the Land Trust has done a great job raising the money, and we're able to put some of our money into it, and it's that's how we have sustained the program financially, for some of you who may wonder about that. So one of the deliverables that we put in those proposals, which was kind of off the wall, but it was like, the outcome of this should be the students have to make a poster. And they're going to present it at the Indian River Lagoon Symposium. Well, why this idea probably came up was when we first had that meeting that I told you about. We were 4 months after we started the Indian River Lagoon Symposium, which again was another crazy idea that we could get all the people up and down the lagoon that were doing research in the lagoon come here for a day and share all their information. That had been done erratically over the years, and we said we're going to do it every year. And again, it worked, surprisingly, kind of, sometimes. But it worked, and it works really well. And so we thought, what a better way to showcase the work of high school students in this program if they were able to present a scientific poster, and they could kind of, hold their own against all those graduate students and faculty members that are producing posters. So it was kind of an outlandish idea. But again, I hope to convince you that it worked. So here's our first offerings. The first year we had our pioneering group, and we had 3 projects. So every year we've had either 3 or 4 projects. They're group projects. They may or may not be from the same high school. It's usually mixed schools. Sometimes it's not. This one was all done by Sebastian River High School students. So one of the big issues at the time was there's this canal that runs right down the center of this property and spills into the Indian River Lagoon. And you all know about the concerns about runoff into the lagoon. And this is a canal that, for example, the county cannot control. The Water Management District can't control. It's operated by the Department of Transportation. And basically it took runoff from Route 1, which is heavily traveled by cars, and kind of ran that water then through this land. And what they did basically was their initial work was to look at the water quality in that canal and see how it changed as it passed through that very special land. And for example, what they saw, and again, I don't expect you to read anything that's up there, but I'm going to throw hours up every now and then, and you can see there's a pattern up there, right? You can see this is dissolved oxygen, and you can see that it's okay, and then all of a sudden some things go really bad, and that's a really low oxygen value. And so one of the things we found was that the water quality in that canal was not terribly good, especially things like dissolved oxygen, which, as you know, is really important for organisms that need to breathe, which is pretty much all organisms. We also had a project that focused on fiddler crabs. So crabs are really important animals in wetlands. They really do a lot of the grazing of what's produced there. They're fed on by a lot of things like fish and other interesting vertebrates that are higher up in the food chain. And we had a group that started to explore and inventory the amount of crab populations in the wetlands. And so, for example, one of the things they found was that the distribution of these crabs was heavily impacted by the dikes that are a higher elevation than the natural land. So all of these areas that are impounded, for those of you who don't know, that was all done in the 1950s for mosquito control, because mosquitoes, when they lay their eggs, need wet, moist sediment or soil. If you flood it, then they can't reproduce. So that's what we've been doing for most of our mosquito control in the nearby communities for a long time. And so basically this showed that, okay, there is some impact of that practice on these really important animals. The other thing we did, which was really cool, because again, if you remember when this was after the great loss of seagrass in 2011 and 2012. And we kept hearing, oh, there's no good, there's no seagrass in Indian River County, it's all dead. There's no seagrass in Vero Beach. So we knew from just a quick look that there was seagrass right offshore from the Coastal Oaks Preserve, and the Land Trust was interested in us finding out what was out there. So we did. And we found actually a really good seagrass bed right off the shore. And if you look up and down the lagoon, where you find good seagrass beds is when you have natural lands. When you have human development, usually the seagrasses right adjacent to that are not doing terribly good. So again, one of these values of what happens on the land can be immediately translated to what happens in the field. They did not get as far as we had hoped to in that first year, but they finished it the following year, and I'll show you that slide. So speaking of the following year, we did continued work. So what you see is sometimes we build on a project the year before, and the way we do that is at the end of the year, and you'll see some of the names there repeat from certain years. So the first one, Van Williamson, he was on both years. And we try to build on unanswered questions. So sometimes the group the previous year said, here's what we need to do next. And then that's what we do. We talk to the land trust and we say, yeah, let's do that. And so they continued that water quality, found basically repeating what they had seen before. We finished the seagrass survey, which gave us a lot more information, as you can see. Again, the bottom line is we had a very nice seagrass bed right offshore. And the new thing that we started that year was to look at fishes. So these impounded areas, such as occur in a lot of these protected wetlands now, the way they are connected to the lagoon now is that they are only flooded part of the year during mosquito time, i.e. the summer, the wet season. The winter time, there are culverts that have been installed to go through the dikes, and we have exchange, we have connectivity back and forth. Again, 1980s, early 80s, Grant Gilmore, the same fish guy I mentioned earlier, he was the one who locally said, we need to do this because animals need to move from wetlands to seagrasses to mangroves to out to the ocean, okay? And so what they did is they had culvert traps, put these traps in these culverts, and we actually monitored what the fishes were that were coming in and out of the lagoon. And we found that the highest diversity was actually closest to the lagoon, less diversity as you went away. And then we had a student, Deanna Bowman, who was at Sebastian, and she had done some summer activity for science, and she says, I'm really interested in soil chemistry, and I'm very interested in what exotic species on land, like Australian pine and Brazilian pepper, might do. And so we said, yeah, we can make a project out of that. And she did that and basically looked at the soil under native trees, natural trees, and these exotic species, these introduced species. And so, for example, casuarina, or the Australian pine that a lot of you know about, has very high acidity, low pH, underneath where the trees grow. And that is very detrimental for other things growing in there. So we call it allelopathic. It's a chemical thing that they do to kind of hold their space. And this one shows the value of removing exotic species, which is a really high priority item for the land trust. But it's nice to have data that supports that. And then into year 3, you'll see that we always do water quality because A, it's a big issue in the lagoon. It's a big issue for the Coastal Oaks Preserve. And it's something that students are really interested in. And what had happened in the meantime, I told you about that canal, the DOT canal, is the DOT had been able to build a retention pond. And now all the water that's in that southern end of Vero that was draining all gets put together along the road and it ends up in a retention pond. And there it either evaporates mostly or it actually may go down into the groundwater. And the bottom line is there's a lot less runoff now going through the Coastal Oaks Preserve. And what these students did was basically document that that was a very beneficial thing in terms of water quality, that water quality in the Coastal Oaks Preserve and that water that was flowing into the lagoon had been improved by this management action. I think it's really important that when you spend a lot of money on something you say is going to fix a problem, that you document it, that it either worked or didn't work, and either way it should be shared with everybody. So again, that's what the high school students did in that project. So another interesting thing happened that year. I mentioned that we had a new teacher who had come to Vero Beach. He launched this great biotech program, and some of the students that are here today are in that program. And somehow I got connected with him, and he said, boy, what an opportunity. I have all these students. They're very interested in biotech. I'm there, wow, biotech, what can I do with that? And meanwhile, I teach this graduate course. It's a weekend class, kind of, and a lot of field work. There was a brand new graduate student. His name was David Bradshaw. I think he's here somewhere. There he is, sitting on right there, aisle 2. So first time he goes out in the Indian River Lagoon is with me on a boat with a bunch of other students, and he's sitting right next to me, and he tells me, I always ask the students, what are you doing? What do you want to do? And he said, well, I'm not from here. I'm from far away. I don't know anything about what this is like, and I'm just trying to get some experience. And he said he was interested in microbiology. And I said, Because previously in our water quality work, we had been doing some coliforms, really very qualitatively. And I said, would you be interested in, I said, hey, I got a deal for you. would you be interested in working with high school students? And you would learn a lot about the local environment, so it would be kind of a win-win, for you. So David's been fantastic. He's been a mentor every year since. And we continue to get a nice pipeline of biotech interested students. And most of them have just worked in the lab. And they really don't get to do the field experience except with something like this. So we take advantage of that knowledge as much as we can. And what they found that year was that fecal coliforms were linked to rainfall, and that there actually was a hot spot in the coastal oaks preserve. It seemed to be coming somewhere not from Route 1 where we thought it would be coming from. And that will be explored again. I'll get to that again. We still had some folks left over from the seagrass team the year before. I said, well, we don't need to do a seagrass survey every year. But they go, yeah, but we like seagrasses. So how about if we look and see what kind of usage the seagrasses are having? What kind of animals are out there in that coastal oaks preserve seagrass bed? And that's what they did. And they worked with somebody in my lab, and they documented the importance of this seagrass bed to juvenile fish and crustaceans and showed patterns of distribution and so on. The fish team also wanted to continue, and we thought that was worth trying some more because we had just figured out how to do it the first year. So we got a lot more data the second year, and basically they documented that much more diversity to the fish community as a result of that extra work. And again, this is mostly the fishes that are using the water in those impoundments in the preserve. And it's mostly young juvenile fish. And they found a lot of things like snook and other fish that are of great interest to fishermen. And this is an important area for that. Okay. Then moving along, going to the next year, we, with David Bradshaw, again in a key position as the mentor, they took what they learned the previous year, and they said, okay, if that's not coming from Route 1, where's those coliforms coming from? And we actually hypothesized it was coming from one of the developments nearby, because there was this little lateral canal, and we took a look at that, and we also had these things called piezometers, which basically are like little wells, so we could start to sample the water that's in the groundwater to see maybe, because a lot of people talk about groundwater and septic tanks and things like that, maybe there'd be something there that we could identify. Bottom line, it wasn't the development. It wasn't the groundwater. It's something in the surface water, and it's being enriched in coliforms on the site. So they believe, their conclusion was that it's probably wildlife, because there's a lot of wildlife there, and actually they produce a lot of the same types of fecal bacteria that we measure as indicators of human pollution. So we still hope to tease that out in more detail before David graduates. Right, David? He and I are going to do that. So we went to an every other year cycle on seagrass beds. Bottom line is they discovered that this was, again, a year where seagrasses were declining. They found, much to our pleasure, you might say, that seagrass was very stable at that location. So that was a good thing. Then we had somebody from the Land Trust who said, oh man, I would like to know more about land crabs. These are different crabs than the ones we mentioned earlier. Land crabs actually live and burrow in these holes. And they like places like mangrove areas and marshes and so on. And so I said, sure, let's figure out how to do that. So they went out and they started to document where the crab burrows were, whether they were active or inactive, whether there's sign of molting by the crabs, got male-female ratios, and got overall distribution patterns. And one of the bottom lines there was that the land crabs preferred freshwater forested areas, not necessarily some of the areas we might have thought at first. And they also estimated the total population of land crabs on the property at 16,000. So imagine 16,000 land crabs just living in that little spot. Land crabs are the ones that you sometimes see on A1A as the females go out to continue their reproduction. And who knows what those males are doing? They're probably hanging out watching football. But it's always the females that we see. And you all know we see a lot. If you've been here a long time, you know we see a lot less of them for a number of reasons. Okay, only 2 more years. But an interesting thing happened. The Land Trust had a great opportunity to do some mitigation on the property, including the development of like restoring the area for marshes. And that's what that depicts there. And also establishing more of these culverts. So I said culverts are really important for the connectivity of those animals that I mentioned earlier. And there wasn't many culverts on this property, so the idea was they wanted to improve the connectivity, and hopefully they thought that would be a good thing for the preserve. And so I don't know how well you can see that, so I draw big arrows. These are some of the sites in particularly where new culverts were going to be installed. So we knew about this, and we knew that it was going to take a while. And so we got together all the students and staff, and we said, well, this could be an interesting opportunity, because if we do studies this year, we'll see what happens at certain sites with knowing where these culverts are going to be, and then let's come back in a year and see what the impact is. And so this year was this first year of that 2-year study was mostly like getting a baseline. And that's the gang from that group back of our Ed Center here. And one of this was David's group last year. Found basically, they basically mapped out where these culverts would be, and they looked at how the water would flow at that point all through the Coastal Oaks Preserve. And so they kind of tracked how water quality changes as water was moving through the Coastal Oaks Preserve. And they found things like that extremely low dissolved oxygen that I mentioned to you earlier. They found really high coliforms, that hot spot that I talked about. But on a brighter side, they also saw that the nutrient load, nitrogen and phosphorus, was greatly reduced as that water worked its way through mostly mangroves. So wetlands are really, when they're working well, they clean up the nutrients from land before they go out into the estuary. So when we got that data, it was right before we did the poster, that was really exciting that we could actually show that that system was actually doing some very positive things for the IRL, for the lagoon. We have the mangrove. This is the first time we started actually looking at mangroves, and we were interested in invertebrates. We call them the fouling communities. And these are all the animals that live on the roots normally of the mangroves. And we actually had these little settling tiles that we used, and we could put them anywhere. And what's good about that is they all start off with nothing on them, and then the students follow it through time and see what happens. And basically what they found was that they got a different rate where they're of colonization, and different species would colonize for those that were right by the culverts. Places that were further away, including where the culverts were going to be within the year, were different. So we had a real nice comparison, and that set up this year's project, as you'll see. But you can see that just by looking at the fact that the pies all look a little different in terms of how they're divided up, there was very significant differences between the culvert sites and the control sites. The land crab team continued. Again, we had some people that were on it the first year, and they said, yeah, we got to keep doing this. And what they decided to do was, and we actually got some help from the mosquito lab. They don't call it that anymore, but it's the UF on Oslo Road has a facility there that's renowned throughout the world for its research on mosquitoes. And they've been here a long time, longer than Harbor Branch. And we got somebody to come out and show us how do you sample mosquito larvae in these holes made by the crabs that are full of water. And that's where a lot of the mosquito breeding's going on. So they got really involved in that, and they would pump out these holes, and they would characterize where the mosquitoes were and what the overall patterns were. And that was a really interesting learning experience for them. And we could see, substantial differences as we went on. And then, for the very first time, we actually went into the forest. It's hard to work in the terrestrial side of things because there aren't really too many paths, and the ground cover is pretty dense. But it's a beautiful set of different hammock-type systems, maritime and hydric hammocks. And it's very reminiscent of the land that we used to have here at Harbor Branch. It's just now to our immediate north, the county now has. And when I first came here, I used to walk back there, so I kind of knew a little bit about how those went. This was largely driven by two of the staff members from the land trust. We couldn't have done it without them, and they kind of showed us how to do these kind of terrestrial measurements, such as measuring tree heights and so on. And basically, one of the major outcomes of that is beginning to map in more detail what the land resources, the terrestrial resources are, and also to identify pockets of exotic vegetation. And some of that was not really fully known by the land trust folks until we were out there doing that work in ground truthing it. And that makes us all the way to this year, year 6. And this year, being every 2 years, we went back out and did the seagrass survey. And so bottom line, if you look at these numbers through time, and those 3 different bars in each group is 3 different years, and any one transect, it doesn't change very much. It's very stable. That's what we saw 2 years before. That's a good thing. But one of the really interesting things we saw was a change in species composition. And the 3rd bar in each group is actually haliduli, one particular type of seagrass. And what we saw was a decline in turtle grass overall, but an increase in shoal grass or haliduli. And typically that means high nutrient. Usually that's driven by a higher nutrient level. So they actually, on their own, the students came up, they found a paper that was done in Florida Bay that showed a similar trend. And I thought that was a pretty interesting speculation, or a very interesting conclusion. And it's something that we certainly should look at, and maybe we need to do a little bit more water quality in conjunction with the seagrass work moving forward. Then we had another project that this is the continuation of the one that tracked the water the previous year. The culverts are now in place, okay? And what did they find? Is basically, the question that they asked. And what they did is they basically demonstrated that the culverts really did improve water quality. And examples of that are the dissolved oxygen once the culverts are opened, because there's so many more culverts, the dissolved oxygen is much better. And the nitrogen load that we're all worried about is much reduced. So the first line in their poster says culverts work. And this is just one way that we can demonstrate that. Then we have another project, and some of you may know we do a lot of continuous monitoring in the lagoon. And we were able, one day I went to a seminar in Boca, and I came back and I said, you know what, we should do this. And we're walking around, at the beginning of the semester saying, yeah, let's do this. And basically what we did is we started to put instrumentation into the impoundment. So rather than relying on just what we can get 3 hours a week on a Monday, hoping it doesn't rain, we started to monitor real time things like oxygen and water height. So this main, let me just show you a mouse, this big graph up on the top, there's a lot going on there, but the bars, the graph to the highest part is actually just water level. And you can see that it's very high. It doesn't change very much. If we zoom in on that, you can actually see a very small, we call it microtides. So actually, even when it's not connected to the lagoon, there are tides in these impoundments. And that's probably because of as high water and low water outside push water up and down from the groundwater. That's a very cool observation, I think. And then you can see that once the culverts opened, which is right here, you can see that very quickly things return to a very nice diel pattern of tides. And you can look at a lot of the other data as well. We got improvement in salinity very quickly, and they monitored how fast that occurs and where it occurs along these different locations. And things like DO and pH also increased. So that's DO, that's pH, which is acidity. And the water color, before the culverts are open, the water is almost orange in color. It's really dark brown, orange. And all this dissolved material is in there. And then this shows the impact, the benefits of having all those culverts and how quickly it changes when they are opened in the fall. And also nutrients, same thing. You can see that the impoundments are very high in nutrients. The culverts are open, and they very quickly return to lagoon levels. And lastly, we had the continuation of that mangrove invertebrate project. And I'm not going to say much more about this because we're going to return to this slide in just a few minutes. So I said that this all leads to this symposium that we've been having now for 8 years. And it's always in February. So again, the timeline for students to do a project 3 hours a week and come up with a poster and present it is pretty challenging. But they've done it, and they've done it well over the years. And at this year's symposium, we had all 4 posters, and these posters are out in the gallery, and we have students from each of the projects that you can talk to afterwards if you haven't talked to them on the way in as well. This one was that mangrove invertebrate project, and every year there are some awards given out, and every year, so 6 years that we've had our posters in there, every year, I don't know how this happens, knock on wood, we've had one of our projects get a Best Poster Award, which is really incredible. This year, this was the project that got it. This year, we had a new award called the People's Choice Award. So everybody votes, not just a couple of scientific judges. And this got also the People's Choice Award for the Best Student Poster Award. Now, the key thing to remember here is this is for all posters. So everybody in the room, 350 scientists and students, voted this the best one. So there was 19 posters. Almost all of them were by graduate students. But the one that got best was high school kids. So, no. So, but let me introduce you to Sky Carbone. And she's going to tell you about her project. I'll turn it up, sorry. Jill, can you turn the mic on?
Okay. So our project was the influence of culverts on mangrove invertebrate communities. So what we did basically was every week we would go out into the lagoon and collect our acrylic plates that were attached to PVC poles by the mangrove prop roots to simulate what grows on the mangrove prop roots. And we would go out weekly from October 1st to December 10th and take pictures of them weekly. And near the end of it is when we started collecting our data. And we put that into CPCE, which is image analysis software, which randomly plots points on a picture you put into it. And you can name each of those points, and that's how we got our data. And you can see through the first month, it was mostly biofilm, which is the orange, that dominates the first month of October, which is it's basically just succession. It's what grows first in the lagoon. And then in November, you can see that the gray half is mostly algae, which grew from biofilm, and it's very common. It's everywhere pretty much. And then also, you can start to see the yellow emerge, which is barnacles, which we did end up having a fair amount of barnacles. They were mostly under the algae or within the algae, so they were hard to actually see, but you could definitely feel them if you touched the plate, and they were very common. And as it went on, biofilm started to come back, especially in the control part and the existing, and barnacles were also pretty big. And from this, we can pretty much say, since we did not do anything with water quality or salinity, our project does not have the authority to say that the mangroves are helping, but we can say that from our data that the mangroves aren't hurting our lagoon, which is always a good thing to hear.
You want to say anything else?
I mean, with the junior scientist program, it was honestly such a great program to go into for anybody, especially if you're into science. Like, doing something like this in high school would look great for you in college and look great for future employment, and it's just great experience to even see if science is something that you really want to go into.
Well said. So she's a senior. She's gonna finish her associate's degree here at Indian River State College. Then she's going to go to UCF, University of Central Florida in Orlando. And she told me she wants to go study botany of all things. Wow. Very good. Yeah. So now I need to tell you about Yasmin. So Yasmin was a student with that land crab project 2 completed cycles ago. And Yasmin wrote me a note afterwards, and she said, I'm going to Indian River State College, and, JSP was kind of cool, and, if you ever need any help or anything. So I contacted Yasmin and said, have I got a deal for you? And I basically said, but you're not going to volunteer. We're gonna, you're going to come. We're going to, it's not many hours, but we're going to pay you for your time, and we really want you to come, and we want to mentor the students. And so she has now for the last 2 years. That's Yasmin as a high school student presenting the poster at the symposium. That's the poster, and here's Yasmin.
Hi. So as Dr. Hanisak said, think way back to 2017. That was my senior year of high school, and actually I was a part of the biotech program at Vero Beach High School, so that's pretty much how I learned about this program. And as a science fair participant and avid learner, I really wanted to do something hands-on with science, so JSP has really grown my ideas of how going into the field and doing the collecting data and applying it to the posters, it's really shaped a lot. So I was involved in the land crab project, and actually the poster is still hanging on the wall if you exit this side here on the left. And I'd be more than happy to talk about it if you guys want me to. And after that, I graduated high school and applied to Indian River State College. And of all things, I'm majoring in biology. So you can tell the program really influenced my decision in staying in science. And as a biology student, you have to learn a lot of chemistry and other biology sciences. So after being invited back to JSP as a mentor to the new students, I was able to not only mentor the students, but also be mentored myself, because believe it or not, it's not just the science and the data. There's a lot of communication skills and teamwork skills. And also, I was able to give a 3-minute talk during the 2018 symposium. So that was a lot for me, prepping and gearing up to give an actual scientific speech, so to say. So it's been an experience of many first things. This is my first employment. That was my first scientific talk, and I really have enjoyed it so far, and it's been a learning experience not only through education, but also communication and people skills building. So that's been.
So what Yasmin just described and what I talked about with David a little bit too, they're both students, and they're not that that far apart from the high school students. I mean, Yasmin is just 2 years out, and some of the other students sitting there, they're going to be where Yasmin is in 2 years, on their career path. So we call that near peer mentoring, and that's one of the things that I think really is a very good thing to do. And so the more times I get more students involved, the better. I can tell you now, what I see in the students. Our last 2 speakers mentioned some of these, and I'm not going to go through the list. You can just read it yourself, but you can just see that there's a lot of things that I think an experience like this can really help them with. I also occasionally, out of the clear blue sky, get emails or phone calls. I'm going to read this one. I wanted to reach out to you to let you know that the junior fellowship program was very effective in preparing me for research work in college, and I'm truly grateful to have been a part of it. It was an invaluable experience for a high school student. It's helped shape my years at UF. It helped me gain a better understanding of scientific work and processes, which has been proven very useful. So that was from our very first year, and his poster, he was part of a poster that still hangs out there. It was the original crab project. He went on to major in zoology, with minors in entomology and Spanish, and I got that 3 years after he was here. So he was basically, and he took the time to just write this out of the clear blue sky. And just one more. Hey, Dr. Hanisak, I just wanted to say thank you so much for everything you, as well as Lisa, David, and John, have done for all of us kids as part of the JSP program. It was truly such a wonderful opportunity to open so many doors for me personally. I scored an awesome internship. It's super exciting. Thank you again. You helped make this possible. You provided me with confidence and made me more passionate and excited about research. That was a student who got majoring in biology up at the University of North Florida, and basically was so excited because got into a lab where they don't let freshmen, do those kinds of things. But when they found out about the previous experience, it opened the door. Final thoughts. We've done all kinds of studies. I went through them, and I think the bottom line is these are important baselines for the management of the Coastal Oaks Preserve. Much has happened in 6 years, much more than we imagined. We didn't know anything about that restoration project. We had no idea that was going to happen. You're going to see enormous transformation as that restoration continues. These high school projects are impacting the future restoration and management of the Coastal Oaks Preserve. And I believe we're developing a long-lasting network of young people who are learning to do science in a really relevant way, and that will result in the next generation having the ability to make wise decisions for resources, the Indian River Lagoon, and beyond. And, over the years, a lot of my talks, I'll have a quote in it. Sometimes it's in the title. Some of you may know I've used Yogi Bear, I've used Einstein, the real Einstein. I used the Walter Matthau Einstein one year. I used Kermit the Frog, maybe even sang the song about being green. Yes, all that is true. This year, I went to Chief Seattle. This is the only known picture of Chief Seattle. Chief Seattle was a very renowned Native American leader. And you say, Seattle, the only thing I know about Seattle is a city. Yeah, they named Seattle after Chief Seattle. And that's pretty special. So I think it tells you that it was more than just the Native Americans that respected his wisdom. Anyway, when I started writing his proposals with Ken, when I first, I described earlier, I came across his lines. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And I put that in the proposal. That's kind of like the tagline. And I don't know, he's probably summarized what we're trying to do as better as anybody. So, this idea that these students are going to help preserve our natural resources for all generations, maybe you think that's, too much hype. Maybe you think that's too much of a stretch. Maybe we shouldn't worry about all generations. Maybe we should just worry about now. Well, right now, a lot of people are deriving great benefits from these preserved lands. Or maybe you don't want to think so far ahead. Maybe you just want to think maybe to your grandchildren. And there's maybe budding scientists out there that can get turned around. So I have to thank a lot of people, because what you need to know is it's not just me at all. I could never have done it. The very first person I engaged on this was John Hart. John Hart wasn't working here at the time. I remember John Hart as a student in Semester by the Sea 2012. And I wasn't going to tell this part, but I will. He actually applied for an internship here and didn't get it. And he wrote me a note afterwards, and he says, well, I understand, but tell me what I can do to be better. And I said, well, here's what you might think about. But, apply next year. Following year, he didn't apply the following year. And I thought, So I contacted him, and I said, John, I have this new project, and I had 2 new projects, and they were both part-time work. And I said, if you're interested, why don't you come and take a chance? John Hart is local. He fishes in the lagoon. He knows it as a fisherman. He went to Vero Beach High School, so he knew exactly, the clientele. Again, near-peer mentor. John's been fantastic. He's really the right-hand person in this entire operation, and he interfaces with everybody else that's on this page. Patrick Monahan has worked for me, hard to believe, a quarter of a century here. Patrick is just like John, very passionate about things, and he has helped out in some of he's a researcher for me, but he also has helped out in education from time to time. The students always love it when he goes out with them. He's very good with them, and he's knowledgeable on the water quality side. So that's what he worked on the first year. And then Tracy Griffin, who I think is in the room somewhere, right here somewhere. I thought she was here. She's an educator, has been an educator here with me for, again, quite a long time. She got her master's degree back before the turn of the century with Craig Young, who was one of those scientists that I mentioned earlier with Semester by the Sea. Those were the four that started in the beginning and have been with me every single year on this project. Kristen also, and some of you know Kristen, she's worked with me about 13 years, and she comes in and out when we do seagrass projects because that's one of her passions. I talked to you about David Bradshaw already, and again, I tried to tell you that was such a good thing for me to match, his learning things about the local environment with him teaching students how to do something that he knew how to do, which was microbiology. Lisa Jackson worked on JSP for 2 years when she was an assistant for me. She also worked on seagrasses. Kate Beckett, she's been on this program for 2 years. She also started as a part-time person. I had this project which we were analyzing images of deeper water coral reefs and algae that grow on coral reefs. And I hired her just because I had a little bit extra money, couldn't get the work done, needed some help. So she really got into the whole computer analysis. Well, about a month later, when we decided, let's do mangrove invertebrates, how are we going to quantify these pictures? I said, Kate, have I got a deal for you? And Kate now has also told us, she has her master's in oceanography, but she's told us that getting involved here, she wanted to get more into education. And she's the one that I called on when I said we had this new group, the Upward Bound folks, and might she be interested in developing that program with me? So Kate's been a great asset on that. Jennifer Cutter has been in our education program for 2 years. The first year she worked with the inverts because that's her background. So that's one of the reasons I drew her in. We needed some invert expertise. Her and Tracy both provide that. And this year she filled in on seagrasses for a good part of the time. You met Yasmin. Yasmin is going to do great things. I can't wait to see what they're all going to be. And then David. David Uberger is interested because we used to call him Land Trust David versus Harbor Branch David Bradshaw. And he was with the Land Trust, I think, for about 4 years, and he was my counterpart. So Ken is like my counterpart when it comes to the management and that initial money, grant writing and stuff. And David was the guy in the trenches who was responsible for their stewardship, their protection of the land. David has a very interesting background. He had worked for the Aquatic Reserve Program, was instrumental in rewriting the management plan, the first time it had been done in 30 years. So he knows a lot about the lagoon. Sometime, I think November, he actually left the Land Trust. He told both Ken and myself, I want to get back into research, and now he's working here with me in the lab. And this year, we only brought him in for kind of the poster review thing because we knew he knew so much about the Coastal Oaks Preserve. We had to involve him, and I expect that David will be involved more, next year after he gets settled into his other work here. So it takes a village, and I just want to thank the Land Trust. I'm so glad Ken could be here. I already mentioned David. Sarah was the person who last year was very instrumental in us doing that vegetation and taught us a lot. Once we've been taught it, now we can do it. And she's now at the Environmental Learning Center, I think, full-time. I mentioned the Harbor Branch people. All of this funding I mentioned already, but I'll put them there. This last year, we had some problems where we didn't have enough people that could handle the seagrass work, and we have a lot of regulations we have to do and so on. And we actually worked with CCA, the Coastal Conservation Association, to the local very, very active members, Captain Paul and Captain Jack, and they provided boat and themselves for our Monday afternoons for most of the cycle this year. Again, another partnership that really helped out. And these are the three teachers I mentioned. We had them at the three schools. So Jeff Bush, he's the biotech person that I alluded to. Karen Daniel at Sebastian River High School, and Nicole Moreau at Indian River Charter High School. And a footnote to Nicole, she was in that very first group of Semester by the Sea in 2001. So that's very special. So again, you can see how all these programs, weave together. And we use the school district. We pay, but they are very gracious. They provide us access to buses, because it's really important that regardless of what the economic status of the students are, that they can get here every Monday. So that's actually our biggest non-labor expense, is actually getting the students here. So that's all I got.